Hi, my name is Harper Purefoy. I'm an environmental health specialist, and I'm really excited to be at this local conference today among you community leaders, just to talk to you a bit about environmental justice and what that looks like in your community. So first, let's start with just a definition of environmental justice and a little history around it. So according to the EPA, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but an easier way to say this all would be to say that the environment where you live, work, learn, and play should not negatively impact your health. You have a right to be in an environment that will not be the cause of your health to suffer. A concept that has really come out of the environmental justice movement is this concept of environmental racism. Now, though environmental racism and environmental justice are not quite the same things, both are really important when discussing significant impacts on a community. According to an online definition supplied by Green Action, which is an organization with a goal to fight these injustices, environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. The organization also lays out a really good way to pick out the difference between environmental racism and environmental justice. And they state environmental justice is the movement's response to environmental racism. So they seem to be really intertwined. Now, environmental racism often results in communities of color being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste, thus leading to a decline in their health. So it's really an important concept to sort of pick out of the environmental justice movement and really talk about it more in depth. So we've seen many instances of environmental injustice throughout time, and as covered in a lecture by Dr. Sean Young at UAMS, we really get some of the history behind environmental justice, which I'll touch on. So in the United States, the movement that sparked more attention to this issue was in Warren County, North Carolina. And it was here in 1982 that the government decided to dump 6,000 truckloads of soil laced with toxic PCBs, thus harming this community. Now, obviously, many of these residents were really upset about this and they expressed their concerns, but they were ultimately dismissed. So, to take matters into their own hands, they met the trucks dumping the soil and laid down in front of them on the road to the landfill to prevent them from actually reaching the landfill. Now, after this, there were 6 weeks of nonviolent protests and marches, and more than 500 people were arrested. Unfortunately, the toxic waste was still eventually dumped in Warren County, but the efforts of the people was one of the first major events in the movement toward environmental justice. Now, there are several more prominent examples of issues of environmental justice throughout history and in the world still today. For example, in the 1960s, Latino workers on a farm run by Cesar Chavez pushed for workplace rights, including protection from harmful pesticides. African American students protested a city garbage dump in their community in Houston in 1967. People of West Harlem in New York City fought against the establishment of a sewage treatment plant in their community in 1968. And even still today, many people fight environmental injustices. In fact, according to a report by the NAACP, people that live within 3 miles of a coal power plant have an average per capita income of $18,400. Now, this is much lower than the average income of $21,587 in the U.S. Also, of those living within 3 miles of a coal power plant, 39% are people of color, which is higher than the 36% proportion of people of color in the U.S. population. Because environmental justice is such a relevant issue, it is really important to know how it impacts your community. So let's dive a little deeper into that. How does it impact your community? So now that we've got a feel for what environmental justice is and some really clear examples, we're going to look more in depth into really what happens in the community. How are those people affected? So one thing we do know is that these disadvantaged communities have poorer health due to toxic waste sites. Research has shown that communities of color in California have more adverse health effects than affluent communities. These include higher risk of cancer from toxic air contaminants and higher levels of nitrate contamination in their drinking water. These communities of color also live closer to hazardous waste sites and traffic. A huge concern with this is that we may not see some of these adverse health effects, like development of cancers, due to the pollution of waste sites. So we won't see these effects really come to fruition until many years later after the exposure. So it's really hard to determine the direct effects that we will see due to exposure to these waste sites in even just a few years span of time. Another effect of environmental injustice on communities is poorer air and water quality. So one obvious example that comes to mind is in Flint, Michigan. Around April of 2014, residents in Flint, Michigan were supplied drinking water from the Flint River. Now this river was severely contaminated with lead, so it's an obvious health risk. And even low levels of lead can lead to brain impairment of fetuses, infants, and young children. And this further can lead to lifelong problems such as reduced IQ and physical growth, cardiovascular disease, and behavioral problems, and that's just to name a few. Now, people drinking this contaminated water were even immediately experiencing short-term effects such as skin rashes and hair loss. So it wasn't like this was some exposure to lead that was taking us a while to pick up on and to see and to recognize that something was wrong in this community. Now, this water crisis also coincided with an outbreak of a severe form of pneumonia that killed 12 people and made at least 87 other people ill in less than a year. Now, when the city attempted to correct this problem by chlorinating the water, it actually elevated levels of total trihalomethanes, which is a cancer-causing chemical. So even when the community is trying to fix things, they're still getting these adverse health effects from these exposures. The people of Flint, Michigan are still not yet completely out of the woods. So many people, even today, still get their water from lead pipes, which is still a cause for concern. Because, as I mentioned earlier, like even low levels of lead exposure can be harmful. The majority of Flint's population is African American, and about 45% of its residents live below the poverty line. So this water crisis is a clear example of environmental injustice and environmental racism. Another health consequence of environmental injustice is due to poor air quality, and it's really targeted at children. So according to a research article from the EPA, Black children have reported higher rates of asthma regardless of family income. 13% of Black children had asthma compared to 8% of white, 8% of Hispanic, and 12% of American Indians and Alaskan Natives children. Black children are also twice as likely to be hospitalized from asthma and 4 times as likely to die from asthma as white children. It is likely that environmental injustices play a huge part in these disparities because children of racial and ethnic minorities are exposed to more pollution. Another effect environmental injustice has on communities is that it limits the opportunity for health-promoting activities. And there's a really awesome video produced by Khan Academy that does a great job of explaining this, so I really encourage you to watch that. It's only a few minutes long, and it really is a clear-cut example of how wealth in the society affects your health and ties in to environmental racism and environmental justice. So with the burden of waste facilities, factories, and energy production, and even transportation resources such as highways or airports, there's limited room for benefits such as parks and green space. So these things that could promote the general health of the public are replaced by things that are harmful to that same public's health instead. And so they don't get opportunities to be out in a park, to walk on a bike path, to do things that more affluent communities can do to promote their own health. And actually another adverse health effect that could come from this lack of health-promoting activity is obesity, which may not be as apparent when you first think of lack of health-promoting activities like parks and green spaces. But the rate of obesity could increase because the people in these disadvantaged communities don't have as many opportunities to be active in the same way that more advantaged communities do. So again, they can't get out and get some fresh air and walk around and do things that would promote their own health. These environmental burdens also leave few alternatives for work or places to live. So when plants come in, when energy plants come in or waste sites come into a community and they take root in that community, it's hard for people to have work opportunities that are safe for them, to have a place that they can live and afford to live in that same community. So now that we know what environmental justice is and how it impacts our communities, we can end on a bit of a higher note, and we can discuss more about what we can actually do about it. So one really important thing you can do is to simply build your awareness. So to really get a ground and a formation in this movement, you really need to know what you're dealing with. You need to build your own awareness around these issues. You need to find the facts and form your own opinions and really get out there and see what's going on around these issues. One way you could do this actually is to simply take a tour of your community or your city and really take note of all the environmental hazards that exist in those areas, and then really discover how those environmental hazards play into, what kind of community is this? Is this a low-income community of color, So just taking a brief inventory of your community as a whole, it can be really useful. You could attend environmental justice workshops or webinars, so there's lots of resources out there for different organizations that do workshops and sort of study sessions for this sort of thing. A really simple way to even do some digging for yourself on the topic is to just pull up YouTube videos on environmental injustice. So I mentioned in the last slide that I pulled from a resource, Khan Academy video, and that was really helpful in just breaking down what environmental justice is and why that's important. There are other videos too, even things like TED Talks, that are really useful in discussing environmental justice as well. So really getting out there and hearing from professionals and people that study on this and really know what they're talking about. You could even start your own study group that focuses on the history of environmental justice. So you could try and take a class at your local community college surrounding these issues. You could research and read up on all the current events surrounding these issues. It's important to be in a group and learn from each other and be able to share ideas and get each other aware and hold each other accountable. It's important not only to know what injustices are taking place, but also to know what, if any, legislation or policies are being put in place to fight these injustices. So, if there's an injustice out there in your community, then really do some digging and see what's been done or what is being done about that issue. Another important thing to do is to get active in educating others and affecting change. So again, being in a group where you can share ideas. You can join an organization that addresses issues of environmental racism and injustices. So like the group that I mentioned earlier, Green Action, maybe get involved with something like that, a nonprofit organization. It may also be helpful to just simply do a quick Google search on environmental justice activist groups, just to see how you can support them, even if you don't want to be involved. Maybe make a donation to one of those groups if you can't be hands-on in one of those groups. And I know that NAACP actually has a list of key organizations, both generally and more targeted toward youth and college-age people. You could even start your own focus group in your community and come up with ways you can fight these injustices in your own neighborhood. So instead of, a little bit different from a group where you talk about these injustices and build awareness with each other, but this is a way to have some accountability. You could attend marches and peaceful protests that encourage environmental justice. Contact your government officials about what you'd like to see moving forward in support of environmental justice. You can simply even engage in meaningful discussions with people that may not know much about these issues. So really here there's power in information, and there's power in really getting out there and getting active and educating each other and holding each other accountable. And I encourage you to really think about some ways that you can support environmental justice and fight these injustices, because it is very important. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for your time.